The very first into Season 2, Episode 1 of Breaking Bad. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more awesome recaps. In a junkyard, after buying meth from Walter White and Jesse Pinkman, a drug boss named Tuco gets really mad. His guy, No Dose, talks to Walter instead of letting Tuco speak, and Tuco beats him badly. When Tuco leaves, Walter starts thinking about how much money he needs for his family and figures out it's $737,000. He knows he has to make 11 more drug deals to reach that goal. But then Tuco comes back and demands Walter help No Dose, who isn't moving. When No Dose dies, Tuco's other worker Gonzo says they should move the body, but Tuco refuses and leaves it there. Walt leaves Jesse and heads home, where his wife Skylar finds him standing by the TV. He forces himself on her, but she pushes him away. Afterward, Walt sits alone by the pool until his son, Walter Jr., finds him and thinks he hurt Skylar. Meanwhile, Jesse gets a gun at a hot dog place because he's worried about Tuco. The next day, Jesse tells Walt they need to deal with Tuco, but Walt says shooting him would only make things worse. They both feel lost about what to do. At the same time, Skylar ignores phone calls from her sister, Marie. Marie and her husband, Hank, argue about her therapy sessions, showing that Marie is unhappy about going, but does it for her problems. At the DEA office, Hank's partner, Steven, shows him a video of two people stealing chemicals from a warehouse. What Steven doesn't know is that the two are actually Walt and Jesse. Hank doesn't think much of their skills as robbers, but is curious about how they used a special chemical called thermite to break in. Steven guesses that the thieves might be college chemistry students, and Hank suggests that messing with the drug trade will probably get them into trouble with the cartels. Walt starts to worry when he spots an SUV parked near his house, so he stays up all night watching the street. Jesse tells Walt to get a gun too, thinking it will make them safer if something goes wrong. But instead, Walt suggests they take out Tuco secretly by using a poison called ricin, made from castor beans. Meanwhile, Hank visits Skylar and asks her to forgive Marie. Skylar gets upset and says her own problems are bigger than Marie's. Both Hank and Skylar realize they know about Marie's shoplifting, but haven't talked about it. Walt and Jesse make the ricin, planning to secretly slip it into the next batch of meth to poison Tuco. As they wrap up, Walt gets a call from Hank, who's at a crime scene. Hank admits that he messed up when talking to Skylar, and Walt tells him it's okay, forgiving him for what happened. Hank's crime scene turns out to be the junkyard, where Gonzo accidentally died while trying to move No Dose's body. Walt and Jesse mistakenly believe that Tuco killed Gonzo, which makes Walt urge Jesse to skip town. They start panicking, thinking Tuco is taking out his own men. Then Hank calls Walt with pictures of two dead men, who Walt knows are Tuco's guys. But later, Hank realizes the deaths were accidents, not murders. When Walt gets home, he dodges questions from Skylar. Suddenly, he gets a phone call and steps outside, only to see Jesse held at gunpoint by Tuco in his car. Tuco forces Walt to get in the car too. Walt and Jesse are trapped in a remote desert hideout after being kidnapped by the wild and dangerous Tuco. Tuco is also taking care of his sick uncle, Hector Salamanca, a former big-time drug boss who had a stroke and can now only ring a bell to communicate. Walt had always called himself Heisenberg when dealing with Tuco, but now Tuco has Walt's wallet and knows his real name and where he lives. Walt's brother-in-law Hank and the DEA launch a big raid on Tuco's whole crew, arresting many of his partners. However, Tuco himself has gotten away. He's the main suspect in the disappearance of Crazy 8. Hank also mentions they found Tuco's fingerprint at the junkyard, where they discovered the bodies of No Dose and Gonzo. This gives Hank a reason to keep investigating. Hank believes Tuco is the new meth boss in town and starts a DEA manhunt for him. But secretly, Hank tells Gomez that Tuco has probably already made it to Mexico. Tuco thinks Gonzo betrayed him to the DEA, causing the raid. He's upset because Gonzo hasn't answered his phone in 2 days, not knowing Gonzo is actually dead at the junkyard. Tuco also starts to suspect that Walt and Jesse might have told the police about their business with him. Walt tries to secretly poison Tuco with ricin, which he mixed into the blue meth in his pocket. Tuco was about to take a hit when Jesse mentions it has chili powder, and Tuco refuses since he hates chili. Tuco decides to keep Walt and Jesse at the hideout until his cousins arrive to take them to Mexico. Tuco plans to vanish into the jungle and build a huge lab where Walt can cook meth around the clock. Hank takes some time off from work to help search for the missing Walt. Detective Tim Roberts is also pitching in to help with the investigation. Skylar tells Tim that Walt had been acting stressed lately. The night before he disappeared, Walt came home looking worried. He got a phone call but didn't answer it. Then he left the house and hasn't come back since. Hank checks Walt's phone records and finds out that no call came to Walt's regular phone, meaning Walt must have had a second prepaid phone, which Jesse had given him. Skylar, feeling sick with worry, has been handing out flyers with Walt's picture. She also finds out from Marie that Walt had a second phone, revealing he was hiding something from her. Hank recalls that Jesse Pinkman used to supply Walt with marijuana, so he starts trying to find him. Hank meets Jesse's mother, who quickly realizes that Hank is with the DEA. She gets nervous, thinking Hank might believe Jesse and Walt are still connected, even though Jesse's been out of school for years. Hank reassures her that he's just trying to find Walt, especially since Walt has a baby on the way. During the conversation, Hank learns that Jesse is driving an old '89 Chevy Monte Carlo, which has a tracking device built in. Using his bell to speak, Tuco's mute, wheelchair-bound uncle signals to him that something's not right with his prisoners. The uncle notices Walt and Jesse whispering about how Tuco didn't take the poisoned meth, changing the TV channel when the news talks about the death of Tuco's 2 associates. They know if Tuco finds out Gonzo didn't betray him, he'll start suspecting them. Walt even took the gun from Jesse earlier, and that makes the uncle even more suspicious. When Walt tries to sneak the poison into Tuco's food, the uncle sees and knocks the plate off the table. The uncle uses 1 bell ding for yes and 2 for no, and lets Tuco know he doesn't trust Jesse and Walt. He warns Tuco that they're making a fool out of him. Angry, Tuco drags them outside, planning to kill them, but Walt and Jesse manage to wound Tuco and run away, hiding when they see another car approaching. Hank arrives searching for Jesse, but ends up facing a wounded and furious Tuco. A quick and intense shootout follows, and Hank manages to shoot and kill Tuco. Realizing that Hank is now part of the investigation, Walt panics and quickly runs away to avoid being caught. Walt and Jesse barely escape from the dangerous Tuco, and now they need to figure out how to explain why they've been missing. Walt comes up with a plan and tells Jesse to handle things his own way. Walt heads to a grocery store, takes off all his clothes, and walks around confused. He ends up in the hospital, claiming he doesn't remember where he's been for the past few days. Even though the doctors find nothing wrong with his body, they assign him a mental health doctor. Walt then vents about his rough life: cancer, a second child he didn't plan for, a low-paying job, and a son with cerebral palsy. He admits he just wanted to escape from it all, knowing he only has about 18 months left to live. But he only confesses this after the doctor promises to keep it a secret. Jesse goes back to his house, driving Badger's car to clean up the basement and take care of the RV. When he gets there, he sees the police hanging around outside but knows they can't go in without a good reason. Jesse pays one of Badger's friends $1,000 to hide the RV in a safe place. Once the police finally leave, Jesse and the friend head into the house. Hank tells his DEA team that he wasn't actually looking for Tuco. Instead, he was trying to find Walter on his own time. He had been following Jesse's car because he thought Jesse was connected to Walter. When Hank finally spotted Jesse's car, he didn't expect to run into Tuco at all. When the DEA finds Jesse at a motel, he says he was spending the weekend with a prostitute. The police don't believe him and think they can get information out of him. Hank has already discovered all of Jesse's hidden money, which is $67,920, in his car. They found Jesse's car where Tuco had taken them. Jesse insists he knows nothing about the money and claims his car was stolen a few days ago. They bring in Tuco's uncle, Hector, to help identify him, but the old man won't cooperate with the police. Since Hank has no proof against Jesse, he has no choice but to let him go free. Jesse has no car and no money, so he calls his parents for help, but they refuse to talk to him. Then, he calls Walter and tells him that Hank arrested him and took his stash of cash, but Jesse assures Walter that Hank doesn't know anything, and the police believe his story. The RV is safe in Badger's garage. Walter decides to start cooking again since Hank has no evidence that connects him to anything. Secretly, Walter leaves the hospital and goes home to move his cash from a diaper box into a ventilator. Later, Hank receives a surprise at the station: a grill made of Tuco's teeth displayed in a clear cube. He sends the blue meth found at Tuco's place to the lab for testing. The lab reports that it is the purest blue meth they have ever seen and that it was made using the P2P method. Hank thinks this batch of blue meth is connected to the theft of the ingredients from the warehouse. He remembers that Crazy 8 also had a similar pure batch of blue meth. Hank visits Walter in the hospital. Walter thanks Hank for coming to see him. After that, Walter goes home with Skylar and Walter Jr. Skylar asks Walter if he had a second phone because Hank got a call right before he disappeared. However, when Hank checked his phone records, he found no call. Walter insists that he doesn't have a second phone. Walt and Jesse meet at a gas station to talk about what to do next. Walt says he needs time to calm his family down after what happened before he can start cooking again. He gives Jesse $600 for his expenses. Jesse argues that half of Walt's money belongs to him since they are partners, and that Hank took away his share. Walt doesn't want to pay Jesse because of his mistakes. Jesse reminds Walt that he was the one who wanted to work with Tuco, so it's Walt's fault too. The next morning, Walt is in a good mood and makes breakfast, which annoys Skylar and Walt Jr. He tries to cover up a phone ring that Skylar heard, claiming it was just his medicine alarm. Skylar gets upset and leaves the house, not telling Walt where she's going. She doesn't come back until much later. Meanwhile, Jesse meets with a lawyer and his parents, who tell him they discovered the meth lab in his basement. Jesse's mom explains that Hank came by asking about him, and then she went down to the basement to see the lab setup. They decide that they will have to kick him out of his aunt's house. Jesse argues that his aunt gave him the house, but his parents explain that he only has permission to live there. His parents actually own the property. They tell Jesse he has 72 hours to leave the house, but the next morning, his mom shows up with workers who start taking everything away to to put in storage. At first, Jesse tries to tell his mom that he can change, but then he gets angry and reminds her that he earned the house by taking care of his aunt when she was sick, while his mom did nothing. His mom gets upset and slaps him. Walter is upset to find out that Walter Jr. has changed his name to Flynn. To spend more time together, he takes Flynn for driving lessons. Flynn shows that he can drive well, but Walter notices he is using both feet on the pedals. When Walter asks him to only use his right foot, Flynn gets mad and accidentally hits a safety cone. Jesse looks for a place to stay, but all his friends refuse to help him. While he is making a call at the gas station, someone steals his motorcycle and everything he has left. Badger had moved Jesse's RV to a lot owned by his cousin. Feeling down, Jesse sneaks into the lot to get his RV back, but accidentally falls into a porta potty and gets covered in waste. He has to sleep in his RV, only able to breathe through a gas mask. The next morning, Clovis, the lot owner, finds Jesse and demands the money he is owed, plus extra for fixing the RV and the porta potty. With no cash, Jesse pleads for more time to pay him back, but Clovis kicks him out and plans to sell his cooking equipment and take away Jesse's supplies. Jesse promises to give Clovis $2,000 in 2 days if he can just be left alone. Clovis throws Jesse off his lot. Determined, Jesse sneaks back in, steals his RV, and escapes by driving right through the gate. While Walt Jr. is at school, Walt tries to talk to Skylar. His overly nice behavior annoys her, and she starts to shut him out completely, refusing to tell him what she's doing or who she's with. Walter is trying to act like the perfect husband, but Skylar is fed up and wants to know what's really going on with him. Walter pretends he doesn't understand what she's upset about. Walt follows Skylar outside and sees the RV parked near his house. He confronts Jesse about contacting him, and Jesse says he just wants his half of the money they've made so he can disappear. Walt gets angry, claiming he has done all the work while Jesse has done nothing, calling him a pathetic junkie who can't follow simple instructions. This makes Jesse furious, and he almost attacks Walt but stops himself. Walt then takes Jesse inside, gives him his share of the money, and offers him breakfast. Meanwhile, back at the gas station, Skylar gets into her car, pulls out a cigarette and a lighter. She hesitates, thinking about her pregnancy, but then lights up and starts smoking. After Walt finishes his first round of chemo, he's told that he'll get the results in about 2 months, right around when his baby is due. But as time passes, Walt starts to feel buried under all the medical bills. His 3-day hospital stay alone costs $13,000, and the money he earned from Tuco is quickly disappearing. One day, as Walt is throwing up into the toilet from the chemo, he notices something blocking the drain. It's the pack of cigarettes that Skylar had been smoking. Jesse keeps his promise and goes back to Clovis to pay for towing and fixing his RV. He also makes a deal to store the RV in Clovis's lot for $500 a month and buys a used car from him. After that, Jesse rents an apartment from Jane, the property manager who lives next door. Even though he likes the place, Jesse has no credit history and can only pay with cash. At first, Jane says no, but she eventually agrees after charging him more for paying cash. Soon after, Walt and Jesse get the RV up and running and start cooking again. Hank gets promoted to an important job as a top liaison for the DEA in Albuquerque, but it means he has to spend his time between the city and El Paso, Texas. He goes out to celebrate with his friends, but on the elevator ride down, he suddenly has a panic attack. The next day, instead of going to work, Hank stays home to bottle the beer he's been brewing. Marie thinks his behavior is strange, but he tells her that everything is fine. After she leaves, a bottle he's holding breaks and cuts his hand. Walt and Jesse meet up again to talk about how they're going to sell their meth. Jesse doesn't want to handle things alone anymore, especially since the DEA is now on his trail. He suggests they set up a network of dealers so they can be both the producers and the sellers. At first, Walt isn't sure about the idea, but Jesse threatens to quit if they don't go with his plan. Jesse reminds Walt that their deal was for Walt to do the cooking while he handled the selling. Later, Jesse invites his friends Combo, Skinny Pete, and Badger to his apartment to talk about making them dealers. He sets the price at $2,500 per ounce. The dealers keep $500, and Jesse gets $2,000 per ounce since their product is top quality and better than the regular market price of $1,800 per ounce. At a cookout to celebrate Hank's promotion, Skylar confronts Marie and insists she apologize for giving her the stolen tiara. Skylar warns that if Marie doesn't, it will cause a rift between them that can't be fixed. With tears in her eyes, Marie finally apologizes. Jesse's dealers are doing great selling the meth, but things take a bad turn when Skinny Pete gets robbed by one of his customers. When Jesse gives Walt his share of the money, $16,000, he takes out the $1,000 that was stolen. He tells Walt that breakage, the loss from stolen or damaged goods, is just part of the business. But Walt is worried that if people find out they can rob them without facing any consequences, things will get worse. Later, Walt shows up at Jesse's place and hands him a gun, telling him to handle the situation. At home, Walt confronts Skylar about her smoking, but she refuses to apologize, pointing out that he's been keeping secrets too. Hank and the DEA have heard the name Heisenberg floating around, but aren't sure if he's a real person or just some made made-up story. Ever since Tuco died, the meth supply in the city has taken a big hit, and the only name the dealers keep mentioning is Heisenberg. Hank gets promoted and is soon assigned to a tri-state drug task force, but he might be facing some health problems of his own. That night, Hank wakes up to what sounds like gunshots. Grabbing his pistol, he carefully moves through the house, ready for trouble. But when he checks, it's not gunshots at all. It's the caps from his home-brewed beer bottles popping off because of the pressure. The next day, Hank drives down to the Rio Grande and tosses Tuco's grill, his trophy, into the river. Jesse decides he needs to face the couple who took advantage of his friend Skinny Pete. He finds out where they live and goes to their old, falling-apart house. The place looks empty and is a mess inside and outside. When Jesse sneaks in, he discovers their young son, who looks very dirty and hasn't had a bath in a long time. The poor boy smells really bad, and he looks hungry too. Jesse quickly gets him some food. When the couple finally comes home, Jesse surprises them and demands they give back his meth and his money. They hand over some of the meth, but say they lost the rest. They also show him an ATM they stole from a store. The man, Spooge, insists that taking an ATM isn't a big deal since the money is insured. But Jesse knows the truth. They shot the store clerk while escaping. The husband, Spooge, struggles to open the ATM for hours, but doesn't have any luck. Tired from trying, he finally falls asleep right next to it. While Jesse is busy playing with the little boy, Spooge's wife sneaks up and knocks Jesse out. She steals his gun and drugs. When Jesse wakes up, he sees Spooge trying to open the ATM from the bottom. His wife, upset because Spooge keeps calling her names, gets so mad that she knocks the ATM over, and it lands on him. After that, she takes his drugs and sits on the couch to get high. Jesse quickly grabs his gun back, takes any money he can find when the ATM finally opens, and calls 911. He hurries outside with the boy, tells him to stay away from the house, and they both run away together. On his first day back teaching after his cancer treatment, Walt shares a story with his class about Dr. Tracy Hall, the person who created synthetic diamonds. Walt explains that Dr. Hall didn't earn much money for his amazing invention, while a big company, General Electric, made a huge profit from it. Things start to get complicated when Skylar receives a phone call from a woman named Gretchen. Skylar thanks her for helping pay for Walt's treatment, but Gretchen keeps the real story a secret. Skylar then invites Gretchen to have lunch with her, and Gretchen agrees to come that afternoon. Walter comes home from school and is surprised to see Gretchen at his house. When she gets ready to leave, Walter offers to walk her to her car. He asks her to keep quiet and not tell anyone about their conversation until they have a chance to talk more. Gretchen drives away without saying a word. Walter meets Gretchen for lunch at a nice restaurant. He asks her if Skylar has told her anything, but she doesn't answer. Gretchen is curious about how Walter is paying for his treatment if insurance isn't helping. Walter asks her not to tell his family or their friend Elliot the truth. He explains that he wants to tell his family in his own way and time. He also asks Gretchen to stay out of his personal issues. Walter feels sorry for lying to her, but Gretchen isn't ready to let it go. She reminds him that he lied not just to her, but also to Elliot and his own family. Walter's feelings about their old relationship, both personal and business, start to show. He feels angry because he believes that Gretchen and Elliot took him out of the deal and made a lot of money from his hard work in research and development. Gretchen responds by saying that it was Walter who chose to walk away from it all. After saying this, she leaves. Later that night, Skylar tells Walter that Gretchen called. She says that Gretchen told her that she and Elliot can't help pay for Walter's treatment anymore. Walter lies to Skylar again and claims that Gretchen said they are out of money and can't support him any longer. Jesse grabs the meth and cash from the ATM, quickly calls the police, and runs away from the place. A lively band plays a narco corrido, singing in Spanish about Walter and the fierce Mexican cartels. The catchy chorus rings out, "The cartels bout respect, and they ain't forgiving, but that homie's dead. He just doesn't know it yet." The music fills the air, setting the stage for a wild story of danger and choices. A student, worried about his 58 on Walter's test, begs for 2 extra points, using excuse after excuse. Walter shakes his head and says, "Don't fool a fool." The answer is no. Then he pulls a cell phone from the ceiling and tries to call Jesse. After hearing the voicemail for the 3rd time, he sighs and says, "Just forget about handling that problem we talked about last week." Walter rushes to Jesse's apartment, knocking loudly on the door. Jane steps out of her place and asks what's going on. Walter claims he's Jesse's dad, but she won't let him use the master key. Finally, Jesse appears and opens the door, looking surprised to see Walter. Once inside, Jesse tells Walter about the crazy thing that happened with Spooge and the ATM machine. He struggles to explain, saying, "There was so much blood, you wouldn't believe it." Walter gets worried that Spooge's girlfriend might recognize Jesse, but Jesse insists she was too high to remember anything. Just then, Badger leaves a voicemail for Jesse, saying he sold his drugs and is ready for more business. Jesse says he needs a few more days to feel better and asks Walter to handle the next pickup. Hank starts his first day with the DEA Border Patrol. He tries to fit in, but his tough personality doesn't match the team. Everyone notices that he doesn't speak Spanish, which makes things even harder for him. Walter meets Jesse's dealers at a museum. They tell him the word on on the street is that Jesse killed Spooge, and now everyone is scared. Because of that fear, collecting money from customers has become a lot easier for them. Skylar goes for a data entry job at a company she used to work for. As she leaves, she sees Ted, the owner's son, and they chat about their kids. Skylar mentions she's interested in the job, and Ted surprises her by offering her old job in the accounting department. Walter tells Jesse they should expand their territory and sell drugs to more areas in the city. He wants Jesse to hire more dealers. Jesse worries that other crews won't like this and might get mad. Walter compares Jesse to a blowfish, small and weak, but able to puff up and look tough. This makes Jesse feel better about the idea. Just as the scene ends, Walter starts coughing hard. During a meeting with Tortuga, a cartel informant, Hank gets frustrated. He tries to push the man for information as Tortuga slowly tells the other agents what he wants in return for his help. Tortuga then says that his name means turtle. I take my time, but I always win. Skylar tells Marie about her new job. While they chat, Skylar mentions that Ted got a little too friendly with her at a company party before. She explains that Ted is married with kids, and it will not happen again. Skylar also says money is tighter than Marie thinks. When Walter comes home, he rushes to the bathroom and starts throwing up in the toilet. The next morning, Skylar gets dressed and is excited for her first day at the new job. Walter worries because Skylar had said she left her old job because of the welding fumes. Jane shows Jesse a drawing she's making. She designs tattoos for a shop, but doesn't have any tattoos herself, saying that's way too big of a commitment. As they talk, a guy on a motorcycle drives by and recognizes Jesse. He shouts, "Hey, you're Pinkman. Everyone's been talking about you." Jane hears the last name and looks surprised, so Jesse quickly walks away. Hank and several DEA agents wait above a valley for Tortuga to arrive. Two agents whisper in Spanish, saying they aren't impressed with Hank and that being a hero in Albuquerque isn't a big deal. Using his binoculars, Hank spots Tortuga's head on the other side of a ridge. When they get down there, they are shocked to find Tortuga's head stuck on top of a tortoise. Hank feels sick and quickly goes back to one of the vans. As the other agents tease him about being queasy, a huge explosion shakes the area. The head was rigged with explosives, and agents are lying around in chaos. Hank ties a belt around the thigh of a man whose leg was blown off, staring in shock at the terrible scene. Jesse gathers his dealers and announces they are staking our claim that we sell what we want, where we want. He tells them to hire more dealers to work under them, saying, layers, like nachos. Walter and Jesse meet, and Walter looks very serious. He thinks they need to raise the price of their meth to make more money. While Skylar is setting up her desk, Ted walks in to welcome her to the office. She thanks him for the job, and he replies, "You don't have to thank me, I need you." He mentions that he and his wife are separated now, and suggests they have lunch together, like old times. After setting up his new TV, Jesse hears Jane come home. He listens through the wall until she goes out back to smoke. Jesse walks outside, pretending he didn't know she was there. He admits he lied about his last name, and that Walter is not his dad. Then, he invites her inside to see the TV. While they wait for it to get a satellite signal, Jane reaches over and takes Jesse's hand. Walt and Jesse hit another bump in the road when Jesse's buddy Badger gets busted by the Albuquerque cops. Even though their business is growing fast and they're raking in cash, something doesn't add up when Walt gets $45,000 instead of the $48,000 he was expecting. Jesse soon finds out from another dealer that Badger has been arrested, and now they've got a new mess to clean up. After the bombing in Juarez, Hank goes back to his old job as a DEA agent in Albuquerque, but he's dealing with some serious stress. He tries to act like everything's fine, but just getting out of bed feels like a huge challenge. Hank came home without telling Marie, and he's keeping quiet about what happened. Marie eventually finds out about the Juarez incident from Hank's co-worker Gomez. Worried about Hank, she asks Walt to talk to him. Hank doesn't want to see a therapist because he thinks it could ruin his career, so Walt tries to cheer him up and tells him to move on. Meanwhile, Gomez informs Hank that they've arrested Badger, who had some of the well-known blue meth. A tricky lawyer named Saul met Badger in jail and offered to be his lawyer for $4,650. Badger calls Jesse and asks him to meet Saul and pay him. When Walt meets Saul, he pretends to be Badger's uncle and gets worried when Saul mentions that the DEA is after Badger's supplier. They think the supplier is a big-time drug boss called Heisenberg. Walt starts coughing during the meeting with Saul. In the end, Walt and Jesse hire Saul, who has a clever way to make sure Badger gets a light sentence without giving away Jesse or Walt's secret identity. Saul wants Badger to snitch on his supplier so he can avoid trouble, but Walt offers Saul $10,000 to keep Badger out of it without him having to testify. Saul doesn't take the bribe, so Jesse and Walt decide to kidnap him to make him change his mind. Saul figures out who Walt is because of his cough and agrees to help by framing another criminal, Jimmy, as Heisenberg to get Badger off the hook. Saul suggests the easiest way would be to kill Badger, but Jesse refuses to even think about that. Jimmy, also known as In and Out, makes a living by getting paid to go to jail for other criminals. Saul says they can have Jimmy pretend to be Heisenberg, but it's going to cost a lot. Jimmy wants $80,000 and 1 pound of pure meth. Out of that $80,000, Saul takes $50,000 for his his part in the plan. The DEA arrests Jimmy after Badger makes a drug deal with him in a public spot, but Hank isn't fully convinced they've caught the real Heisenberg. Something about it just doesn't sit right with him. Using a private investigator, Saul finds Walt at the school. He visits Walt and points out that he's too easy to locate. Saul offers to be Walt's full-time lawyer and advisor, helping him cover his tracks and stay out of trouble. Meanwhile, business is booming, and Walt and Jesse are making a lot of money with their operation. One Saturday, Skylar heads to work, and Walt notices that she's dressed really nicely for her job with Ted. This makes him wonder what's going on. Meanwhile, Jesse has spent the night with Jane and finds out she is working on overcoming her addiction. Later, after Jesse orders a mattress for his apartment, he and Jane end up getting intimate again. Walt goes to the hospital with his family for a CT scan to check how he's responding to chemotherapy. The doctor says the results won't be ready for a week, but Walt sees a scan of his lungs and notices a big dark spot. Thinking he doesn't have much time left, and realizing that all the recent bills, plus the money he's paying a lawyer to hide his cash, are leaving him with hardly anything for his family, he feels desperate. The money is cleaned at 75 cents on the dollar, and there's also a 17% fee on top of that. Walt decides to spend a few days doing nothing but making more meth. He tells Skylar he's going to visit his mom for a long weekend to cover up why he's gone. He then convinces Jesse to help him for those days. At first, Jesse doesn't want to because he had a date planned in Santa Fe with Jane, but Walt says they have to use all their methylamine before it goes bad, so Jesse cancels his plans to help. After Jesse picks up the extra supplies and grabs Walt from the airport, they head out to the desert in the RV to cook. Walt tells Jesse to leave the keys somewhere safe, but Jesse leaves them in the ignition without realizing it's draining the battery. After a few days of cooking, Walt figures they've made almost $1.2 million worth of meth. The generator runs out of gas, and Walt wants to refill it and keep working, but Jesse talks him into taking a break and finding a hotel for the night. When they try to start the RV, they discover the battery is dead. They try to siphon gas from the RV to the generator to jumpstart it, but some gas spills and it catches on fire. Jesse uses all their drinking water to put the fire out. Stuck, Jesse suggests calling Skinny Pete for help using Walt's phone. Even though Walt knows Skylar might see the call on his phone records, he lets Jesse do it. Jesse tries to give Skinny Pete directions, but they're not sure if Pete got everything right. When he doesn't show up, they call him again and find out he's way off the mark just before the phone dies. Walt takes apart the generator and tries to charge the RV's battery by hand cranking it. It works for a moment, but the battery dies again quickly. Feeling defeated, Walt becomes sad and starts suffering from heat exhaustion. Jesse notices that Walt thinks he's going to die, especially when Walt starts coughing up blood. Walt feels like he deserves it because he's been lying to his family for so long. Jesse doesn't give up though and tries to lift Walt's spirits. This gives Walt an idea to build their own battery using what they have in the RV. The homemade battery gives them enough power to start the RV, and they manage to drive back to Albuquerque. Jesse drops Walt off at the airport and promises him that if anything happens to Walt, his family will still get their share of the money. Walt and his family go back to the doctor the following week, and they get some surprising news. Walt's cancer is in remission, and it has shrunk by 80%. The growth Walt thought he saw was just swollen tissue in his lung, and the blood he coughed up was from a small tear in his esophagus, which will heal over time. Walt's family is overjoyed, celebrating the good news, but Walt, deep down, feels trapped. He has an angry outburst in private, realizing that his lies and his secret drug business won't end now that he's not dying. After finding out that his cancer is in remission, Walt follows Skylar's advice to take the week off from work, but instead of relaxing, he secretly meets up with Jesse. Walt shares the good news with Jesse and says he's done with the drug business now that he no longer has to pay for his treatment. At a party Skylar throws to celebrate Walt's remission, things take a turn. While everyone is enjoying themselves, Walt decides to pour some tequila for his son, Walt Jr., who is only 16. After Walt pours him 3 rounds, Hank steps in and takes the bottle away, saying Walt Jr. has had enough. Walt, clearly upset, demands the bottle back, causing tension between him and Hank. The moment is broken when Walt Jr. suddenly throws up into the pool, leaving everyone in shock. The next day, Skylar refuses to answer any of Walt's calls, even though he's trying to apologize for what happened at the party. To take his mind off things, Walt decides to work on their house. He notices the old water heater is in terrible shape. It's rusted inside, leaking everywhere, and spitting out brownish pink water. Walt goes to the hardware store and buys a fancy tankless water heater for $1,200. When he gets home, he installs the new heater all by himself and tests it out with his son. During this, Walt apologizes to his son for how he acted at the party. His son, instead of being upset, tells Walt he's proud that he kept up with the drinking at the party, but the job isn't done yet. After replacing the water heater, Walt realizes the floor underneath is completely ruined, soggy, and falling apart, so he tears up the floor and, while doing so, finds that the foundation of the house is full of fungus. Determined to fix everything himself, Walt starts working on the foundation too. When Skylar comes home, she's not too happy that their house has turned into a big construction zone. At work, Skylar shares her worries about Walt's health with Ted. He can tell she's been staying late on purpose and asks her about it. That's when Skylar breaks down. She admits that she doesn't feel hopeful, even though Walt's cancer is in remission. Deep down, she's afraid because she knows the cancer could come back at any time, and that thought keeps weighing on her. Ted understands what Skylar is going through, since he went through something similar while taking care of his father during his final days. In that moment, they gently hold hands, comforting each other. The next day, as Ted is about to leave, Skylar comes up with an excuse to keep him around a little longer, wanting to spend more time with him. While at the hardware store to pick up new floorboards, Walt spots a young man loading his cart with materials that look like they're for making drugs. Walt, knowing exactly what the guy's up to, gives him some helpful advice on the right ingredients. The young man, startled, quickly leaves. When Walt steps outside, he sees the same guy with his partner, and without hesitation, Walt warns them to stay away from his territory. The two guys, nervous, back off and leave. In that moment, Walt realizes he's not done with the drug business after all. He's made up his mind. He's staying in the game. Meanwhile, Jesse awkwardly makes breakfast for Jane and suggests they spend the day together. As they eat, Jane looks through some drawings he made of superheroes. She smiles and points out that all the heroes look just like him. Their moment is interrupted by a knock at Jane's door. When they open it, they find her father, Donald, who owns the property, standing there. The surprise visit catches them both off guard. When Jesse steps outside to talk to Jane's dad, Jane pretends she doesn't know him. This leaves Jesse feeling hurt and confused. Later, Jane explains that she was just trying to protect him from her strict father, but Jesse isn't convinced. He feels like she doesn't take their relationship seriously. Frustrated, he turns to meth to calm himself down, but his mood changes when he finds a drawing Jane slipped under his door. It's of a superhero called Apology Girl, and it looks just like her, bringing a smile back to Jesse's face. Walter's doctors suggest he have one of his lungs taken out and replaced with a new lung from a donor to help him live longer. The surgery is very expensive, costing around $170,000 to $200,000. Walter decides to go ahead with the surgery in 4 weeks. Jesse and Walter manage to cook up 40 pounds of meth in their last batch, but they're having a hard time selling it on the streets. So far, they've only been able to sell 2 pounds. Combo, one of their sellers, is on the corner when he notices 2 rival dealers watching him. Sadly, he's killed by a young boy working for them. After Combo's death and Badger's run-in with the police, Skinny Pete gets scared and quits the drug business, which shakes Jesse's reputation as a tough guy. Walter and Jesse meet with Saul to figure out their next step. Saul tells them they're bad at selling and need someone smarter and more cautious than Tuco to buy their product in large amounts. He offers to contact a distributor he knows about, but warns it will be tough since this person is very careful. Jesse feels terrible that Combo's death is his fault, and that night he tells Jane to leave so she won't fall back into her addiction while he smokes meth. But Jane, though unsure, decides to stay, even though she had been clean for 18 months. The next day, Walter goes to a local chicken restaurant called Los Pollos Hermanos, where the person who could help sell their meth was supposed to meet him. Jesse shows up late, still acting strange from using drugs, and leaves soon after. No one talks to Walter at the restaurant, but later, he figures out that the distributor had been watching him the whole time and decided not to do business with them. Meanwhile, Jane falls back into her old habits and introduces Jesse to heroin. The next day, Walter returns to the same chicken restaurant and waits there until it closes. After a while, he realizes that the man who seems to be the restaurant manager is actually the distributor he's been trying to meet. Walter asks for a meeting, and the manager eventually admits that he is the one in charge. However, he says he can't do business with someone like Jesse, who is using drugs. Walter insists that their product is the best out there and explains that he works with Jesse because Jesse follows his orders without question. The manager tells Walter he will contact him if he chooses to work with them, but warns him not to trust a drug addict. The distributor's name is Gus. Skylar joins the office in celebrating her boss Ted's birthday and sings him a flirty version of Happy Birthday. Later, while going through the company's accounts, she notices lots of mistakes in the payments. When she confronts Ted, he admits that he's been faking millions of dollars in income to keep the business running and make sure his employees still have jobs. Skylar tells him she won't report him, but she can't be involved in anything illegal. Even so, she ends up returning to work later on. Walt gets a message to come back to the restaurant where the real manager tells him that the man he met before is actually the owner of several stores, and his name is Gus Fring. Just as Walt is about to leave, a man named Victor steps in his way and gives him a task: deliver the meth to a truck stop within the next hour. Walt hurries over to Jesse's apartment and forces his way in, finding Jesse and Jane passed out from using heroin. Meanwhile, Skylar goes into labor and tries to reach Walt. Torn between his family and the job, Walt chooses to meet with Gus instead. The deal is to deliver 38 pounds of meth in 1 hour for $1.2 million. Walter delivers the product to Gus just in time, but he misses the birth of his baby daughter. When he finally gets to the hospital, he sees that Ted had already driven Skylar there. Afterward, Walter goes back home to hide his money, stuck stuffing it inside the walls of his house. Earlier, Walter had slapped Jesse awake from a drug-filled daze to find out where he had hidden the drugs. When Jesse woke up, he thought he had been robbed, not knowing that Walter had already taken the meth to Gus. Jane gets a call from her dad, Donald, waking her up because she's late for a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. At lunch, she doesn't tell him that she's using heroin again and pretends not to know Jesse when her dad asks about him. Meanwhile, Jesse freaks out, thinking the meth was stolen, and calls Walter to say he's been robbed. Walter keeps quiet, but then Jesse notices 4 messages on the answering machine. That's when he figures out that Walter sold the meth to Gus. At the same time, Skylar decides to go back to work to help pay for Walter's surgery. Jesse talks to Walter about getting his share of the money, but Walter says he won't pay him until Jesse can show that he's clean and sober. Walter promises to give Jesse the money when he knows that both Jesse and Jane are doing well. Later, Jesse and Jane take another hit of heroin in his apartment. As Jesse starts to pass out, he complains to Jane about Walter not giving him his money. He tells her that he should have $480,000, which is half of $1.2 million after paying Saul's 20% fee. Donald calls Jane again when she is late to another rehab meeting, not knowing that he is waiting right outside. When he sees her come out of Jesse's apartment, he rushes in and finds signs that they have both been using heroin. He is really angry that she has gone back to using drugs and threatens to call the police. However, Jane promises that she will go to rehab the next day. Donald calms down and gives her another chance, saying she has one day to take care of her work and personal stuff before going to rehab. After he leaves, Jane tells Jesse that if they have enough money, nobody can make them do anything. To help pay for his dad's surgery, Walt Jr. creates a website to collect donations for Walter's medical bills. Saul quickly sees this as a way to move Walter's money without anyone getting suspicious. He tells Walt Jr. that he will hire a hacker to make it look like the money is coming from computers all around the world. The hacker will send in small amounts so nobody will notice anything strange. After finding out about Jesse's payday, Jane blackmails Walter into giving Jesse his share of the money. She threatens to tell everyone that Walter is a high school teacher who sells drugs and that his brother-in-law is a DEA agent. If this got out, it would ruin Walter's whole family. Walter hands over the money to Jesse and Jane, who are thrilled and start talking about getting clean, but they still feel a strong urge to use their leftover heroin. Later, Walter goes to a bar and runs into Jane's dad, Donald. Donald says you should never give up on your family because they're the only ones you really have. Inspired by Donald's words, Walter decides to go back to Jesse's house. Later, Walter goes back to Jesse's place to try to make things right and help him overcome his addiction. When he gets there, he finds Jesse and Jane passed out in bed after using drugs. They are lying on their sides, and Walter shakes Jesse to wake him up. As he does this, Jane rolls onto her back and starts to vomit, which makes it hard for her to breathe. Even though Walter knows how to help in emergencies, he just stands there and watches as Jane struggles. Before leaving the building, Walter starts to cry. A team of investigators from the NTSB carefully gather and sort through the wreckage, picking up items like a half-burnt pink teddy bear that had landed near the Whites' home. Far away, 2 tall columns of smoke rise into the sky. Jesse wakes up and finds that Jane has died. In a panic, he calls Walt for help. Walt contacts Saul, who sends his cleaner, Mike, to handle the situation and guide Jesse. Feeling guilty over Jane's death, Jesse is heartbroken. Mike quickly cleans the apartment, getting rid of all the drugs and any other evidence. He also takes a bag of money with him. Mike tells Jesse to simply say, "I woke up, I found her, and that's all I know." If the police arrest him, Jesse is instructed to stay silent and call Saul. Mike also tells him to wear a long-sleeved shirt to hide the needle marks before dialing 911 to report Jane's death. Jane's father, Donald, arrives at the apartment and finds out his daughter has passed away. Jesse is being questioned by the medical examiner, but he can't even look Donald in the eyes. Feeling more and more guilty, Jesse believes Jane's death is his fault. Overcome with sadness, he runs off to a crack house trying to escape his pain. Walt's money is secretly funneled through his son's website, catching the attention of the media and filling him with guilt. Marie first told the story to a friend who works for a newspaper, and it was printed. She also contacted a TV station, leading to a news crew coming to their house to interview Walter Jr. and the family. Feeling overwhelmed, Walt takes out his hidden second phone, which he had stashed in the toilet tank. Worried about Jesse, Walt gets help from Paul and Mike to find him and takes him to rehab. While there, Jesse tells Walt that he loved Jane more than anything in the world. On the day of Walt's surgery, while under anesthesia, he accidentally mentions having a second cell phone. This makes Skylar suspicious about what he's been hiding. Her curiosity leads her to dig deeper, uncovering many of Walt's lies. Feeling betrayed, Skylar decides to leave him. She discovers that Gretchen and Elliot never paid for any of Walter's medical bills, even though every payment, totaling $100,000, was made on time. So, where did the money come from? She also realizes that Walter hasn't visited his mother in over a year, and that his mother doesn't even know he has cancer. Walter had lied when he said he was going to visit her. Hank isn't convinced they've caught the real Heisenberg. Gomez points out that since the arrest, the blue meth has has vanished from the streets, but Hank suspects that Heisenberg has gone regional, spreading the blue meth to nearby states to stay away from Albuquerque, knowing the law is watching. Meanwhile, Gus figures out that Walter has lung cancer and that he's Hank's brother. Gus visits the DEA office to show support for a city marathon fundraiser. While there, he meets Hank, who is raising donations for Walter's surgery. That's when Gus spots a photo of Walter and makes the connection. Jane's father, an air traffic controller, is heartbroken over his daughter's death, which Walt could have stopped but didn't. In his sadness, he allows a terrible accident to happen in the sky above Albuquerque, causing two airplanes to crash into each other. Debris and human remains rain down onto the White's house and much of the city. Meanwhile, Walt is sitting by his pool, thinking about everything that has happened. Suddenly, he looks up and sees the collision above his home, and a pink teddy bear falls into his swimming pool. To be continued. Make sure you don't miss what happens next in Season 3. Hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay tuned.